One of the most frequently asked questions I get on my channel, aside from maybe what varnish I'm using, is what colors I have on my palette. I've made several videos going through what's on my full studio palette, but I haven't really had a chance to talk about limited palettes. Is there one primary color palette that everyone should be using? When I was learning to paint, the default limited palette was based on what I would call earth tone primaries, so alizarin crimson, yellow ochre pale, and ultramarine blue deep. I knew at the time that more powerful palettes existed, but assumed that it would be based on cadmium red medium, cad yellow pale, and ultramarine. And what I've learned since then is that this is actually pretty far from a true primary palette. If you ever tried to use this particular palette for a more colorful painting, say of flowers, you will probably know what I mean. It turns out that with these super chromatic, intense colors, you still can't mix a lot of the color spectrum. Now, one of my first videos that I uploaded on my channel was a video on why I couldn't mix a certain purple that I needed while painting a set of pansies. I'll link that video in the upper right hand corner if you haven't watched it already, but basically I gave an overview of how color mixing works and why we can't mix anything more chromatic than what's already on our palettes. And with a palette like Cad Red, Cad Yellow Pale, and Ultramarine, it turns out that there is quite a lot that we can't mix. So what gives? If these are primary colors, shouldn't we be able to make anything? Well, yes and no. On the one hand, painting with pigments is inherently an imperfect practice. After all, we aren't painting with pure light, which is pretty much what we would need to actually have the full spectrum of what we can observe in nature. And some pigments, despite looking perfect when you squeeze them out of the tube, just don't have the color mixing properties that we need to get predictable results from them. So even though I'm going to be talking about a palette today that is far more powerful than this cadmium palette that I'm discussing right now, there are still some inherent limitations there that I think are important to understand. But on the flip side, yeah, if you actually are working with true primary colors, you should be able to mix quite a lot. So today I want to talk about the flaw in typical limited palettes that are based on primary colors and discuss some better pigment options that you can use in their place. Now, before we jump into the palettes themselves, I want to talk about how I'm going to be comparing each palette and showing them to you. I talk a lot on my channel about Alla Prima II and have brought up the color charts that Richard Schmid mentions there in his book. Color charts were my first stop to understanding the scope of my palette's ability, and basically every painter I know who studied with Richard Schmid recommends to all of their students who want to further their grasp and mastery of color that they do color charts themselves. Not only do the charts show you a broad range of what your palette is capable of, they are invaluable for furthering your understanding of color harmony from firsthand experience. And they similarly teach you quite a lot about working with a palette knife. Because I've mentioned these color charts so much on the channel, but haven't had a chance to really show you firsthand how to set them up, complete them, and then use them, I thought this video would be a great opportunity to do just that. So to compare each of the limited palettes today, I'm going to be comparing them by making color charts for each one. In the process, I'll be talking about how you can make your own charts, how to use them, and of course, I'll be comparing and contrasting each of the palettes along the way. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the charts themselves. So let's talk about the color charts. So the basic idea of a color chart is that it's a visual representation of your entire palette. And you have a chart for each color and then a chart for the palette on the whole. So this is the first palette, or the first chart, I should say, from last year's palette. You can see I labeled this, well, maybe you can't see, base palette over here. And then over the top, you have labels for each of the colors that I put out. Now, those of you who have followed my channel for a while know that these are no longer the colors that make up my base palette, but it's very, very close, and this was still super instructive, and I refer back to these charts often. Now, that being said, it is really helpful to revisit the charts, so I probably will be redoing these sometime in the near future with the current palette that I use. But for this discussion, this is going to be perfect. So going over this, you can see that the palette that I was using is cadmium lemon, cadmium yellow pale, cadmium orange, cadmium red, alizarin crimson permanent, transparent oxide red, transparent oxide brown, transparent oxide yellow, viridian, ultramarine blue deep, and cobalt blue light. Now, if you want to know the palette that I'm using currently, I will link to a video in the upper right hand corner so that you can actually see what of this has changed. But for now, I want to talk about the chart itself. So the basic idea with each of these charts is that you're going to take your base colors up at the top, and then you are going to gradate them to like a value level 1 or 2, basically, at the bottom. Now, obviously, each of these colors starts from a different place, so the shifts in value for cad lemon is going to look a lot more subtle than shifts of value for something transparent like alizarin permanent or transparent oxide brown here. Now, ideally, colors that kind of start from a similar value will appear to have similar gradations as you go down, but of course, no chart is going to be perfect. So if I were redoing these, I probably would have darkened these two and maybe lightened this particular one. But that's, you know, it's the joy of doing something that isn't meant to be perfect. So with this chart out of the way, I want to just talk about the first of the actual dominant color charts. So this is actually my cadmium lemon chart, as you can see here on the left. And then if you look up at the top, you'll see that all the labels are actually the same as the other chart. So the idea here with this particular chart is that you are taking your dominant color, so cad lemon, and you want, visually speaking, every color on here to be 75% cad lemon and then 25% whatever color it's being mixed with. So for instance, if we have cad lemon over in this first column, then this is just straight cad lemon. Then when we get to cad yellow pale, it's 75% cad lemon and 25% cad yellow pale. Now, one thing I want to note here is that this isn't a percentage of the actual amount of paint that you mix, it's just visually what the result is. So if you're mixing something super weak, it's going to take a different amount of paint as something that's super strong. All right, and then going across this chart, you see I just continue. So we have cadmium orange, so this is 75% cad lemon, and then 25% cad orange, and then I just continue to go until I've hit every other color on the chart. And the result is that it should look super duper harmonious, which I'm going to talk about here in just a moment. But first I want to show you what it looks like for the second color on the chart, because what happens is normally, so this is cad yellow pale, this is my cad yellow pale chart. Normally, cad lemon would be in the first position and then cad yellow pale would be in the second. But whatever color is dominant for that particular chart, it goes in the first slot, and then everything else shifts to accommodate it. So you can see that even though cad lemon and cad yellow red are super similar colors, let's see if I can actually back up enough for you to see all of this, their charts are somewhat different. You can see it over with the ultramarine and cobalt blue on the end, as well as the viridian too. It's just a little bit more vibrant in that upper chart, which is cad lemon. And then similarly, you can see that the yellows for the Cad Yellow Pale chart are just a little bit richer and maybe more golden than the sort of more neon Cad Lemon chart. And this just continues all the way down the line. So for instance, for the Cad Orange chart, I have Cad Orange, Cad Lemon, Cad Yellow Pale. So that's just the only thing you kind of want to be wary of as you're planning your charts. You might want to go ahead and write out the colors that are going to appear on it before you actually start mixing anything, because I've definitely messed that up before and had to start over on a chart, which is pretty frustrating. Now, I talked earlier about this idea of color harmonies, and I think that's especially important for looking at these charts. So obviously you probably aren't going to make that many paintings that are realist paintings that kind of look like this. If you were to totally abstract it and like make this weird blocky representation of what all of the colors in the painting look like, you're probably never going to have a painting that has this broad of a gamut. However, if you were painting like lemons and limes and you broke down that still life painting, you might actually get something that looks somewhat like this Cad Lemon chart. Or if I kind of go back through some other options here, it would be very possible, for instance, this is my transparent oxide red chart, to have a portrait that can be distilled into vaguely these colors. And Richard Schmid knew this, and he has talked about it with his students, this idea that these aren't just there for you to kind of identify or just kind of like realize after the fact what color was the dominant color for a given painting. He also used these to plan paintings. So I think going back to the Cad Lemon chart, I've heard a story of him actually planning a still life where he was picking out bits of citrus that happened to fit with this specific chart. So he would actually use this when composing a still life. Similarly, landscape painter Mark Bogus tells me that he very intentionally brings all of his color charts with him when painting plein air, or at least he does sometimes. And he will literally like hold up a chart to the vista that he's about to paint to figure out which one of the charts best fits that particular scene. And the result, so let's say that he finds a scene that matches transparent oxide brown here. The cool thing about looking at this palette is that literally every color here has some transparent oxide brown mixed in. And what results from that is that this looks super duper harmonious. Now, if he holds this up to his scene and decides that this would be a great color for him to base his palette around for that painting, or rather a great way to harmonize the color of his painting, he knows that literally every color he mixes should have some transparent oxide brown in that mixture. And one other thing that I think is really cool is that he actually, in kind of explaining this in the workshop where I learned about this, he gave this example of a specific painting, but the specific painting had this really interesting like blue highlight happening. And the way that he explained that was that he took his ultramarine blue chart and he went over to the spot for transparent oxide brown and simply kind of adopted this one column of the ultramarine blue deep chart that was dedicated to transparent oxide brown, and kind of like just sort of visually, or mentally added on to his existing transparent oxide brown chart, and those became the colors for that painting. So this is a really awesome tool regardless of what kind of painting you do, If you're interested in having really harmonious color, these can be super beneficial, whether you are curating your own still life or you are going out to do some plein air painting or working from a model. Now I imagine if you work from models, you probably aren't going to be using a lot of these like cadmium charts. It's probably all going to be earth tone, but nonetheless, this is extremely helpful. Now let's go ahead and make the charts for our new primary palettes. To begin, I need to map out a 5x3 grid of 1-inch squares with a 1/4 inch buffer between each little cell. I want to stipulate here that I chose to use some leftover clayboard panels I had, so I was limited on the amount of space that I had. Clayboard is also kind of a pain to cut down to size, so rather than doing a series of charts that were only 3 squares wide, I opted to combine the charts so that it would be 1 panel per palette. This means that the charts that I made are not the same layout as it should be or what you saw previously with last year's charts. So if you're planning on doing your own, please refer to Schmid's instructions in Alla Prima II or just take a look at the charts that I showed you from last year. Now, going back to the new charts, the reason that I want to have a 1/4 inch buffer between the squares is so that I can use 1/4 inch tape to mark the grid. This is going to be extremely helpful, as you will see later. After I put the paint on with my palette knife, I can simply remove the grid of tape and suddenly everything will look super clean and super satisfying. Now with that done, let's take a look at the 3 primary palettes that I'm going to be comparing. Alright, so these are going to be the colors that we are looking at today. So first up, we have Permanent Rose, or Cad Lemon, and then Phthalo Blue green shade, and then that will be tinted with Williamsburg Titanium White. Then we're going to take a look at our standard primary palette, which is going to be Cad Red, Cad Yellow Pale, and Ultramarine Blue Deep. And then we will also be using the ultramarine on our last palette, which is more of an earth tone palette, which is Alizarin Permanent, Yellow Ochre Pale, and then of course the same ultramarine blue deep. Then finally, last item, you're going to need a palette knife, and you want the palette knife to be pretty small so that the main part of it is the same size as one of these squares. Now with that out of the way, let's see these color charts come together. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our kind of typical limited primary palette of Cad Red Medium, Cad Yellow Pale, and Ultramarine Blue Deep. Now, as you'll see as I go through the rest of these charts, I kind of went back and forth on what format I wanted to use for these. And for these first 2 palettes, here's what I went ahead and did. I started with the plain red color, gradated that to white, so that's the first column. Then I introduced yellow to that red color, gradated that to white, and then did the same for blue. Then after the first 3 columns of red were done, I went ahead and switched over to doing the same thing for yellow. So it would be straight yellow, yellow with a bit of red, and then yellow with a bit of blue, and then the same thing for blue, where I would start with the red and then go to the yellow. And you can see in this palette as it comes together that there are a few columns that are pretty chromatic, specifically the Cad Red and the Cad Yellow columns. But once you start mixing them together, this is actually surprisingly subdued for a palette. Then next, after a little bit of cleanup, I'm actually going to shift gears and take a look at this more earth tone primary palette, which as a reminder is Alizarin Permanent, Yellow Ochre Pale, and Ultramarine Blue Deep. I lay this one out basically the same way as the cadmium dominant palette. The only thing that kind of looks a little bit weird here as I fill this out is that I was using like my last scrap of clayboard for this particular palette, so the very last column is a little bit squished, but the effect is still the same. As this one comes together, what you may notice is that there are fewer chromatic columns here, but this is actually surprisingly cohesive and harmonious looking, which I'm going to come back to later. While this may not be as powerful as that cadmium palette or the palette we're about to look at, it still has some pretty distinct advantages which you might not want to write off. And this brings us to the final palette we're going to look at, which is what I am pitching as a more powerful alternative to the typical cadmium palette that we paint with. So as a reminder, the colors that I'm using here are Permanent Rose, Cad Lemon, and Phthalo Blue. And if you're familiar with color theory or even printing, this might actually remind you of something, which is the traditional ink setup that features cyan, yellow, and magenta. So you may be wondering, well, hey, primary is red, yellow, or blue, so what do these three colors have to do with it? As I've said before on the channel, I am not a physicist. There are other channels that are going to do a much better job of explaining the physical light properties that are in play here, but here's what I will say. Our existing idea of primary colors is largely influenced by the way that we were taught them in primary school, which used things that we easily had within reach. So our teachers were likely to use pretty simple language and say red, yellow, blue, rather than kind of more particular color names like cyan and magenta. The idea here is that the red that we think of when we think of primaries has always been magenta, but because we weren't going to teach that particular word to kids, we were much more likely to just say red and thus think of something like the red of a stop sign. Further complicating this, you'll notice that the colors that I'm mixing here are all pretty modern. We didn't have Permanent Rose or Phthalo Blue 200 years ago. If you were painting at that time, you were much more likely to be using that more earth tone palette, or if you were looking at the turn of the century, when cadmiums were first becoming popularized by the Impressionists, maybe you could begin to use that. But now that we have these modern colors in our arsenal, I think we ought to be using them. And I think the potency of this color chart you're seeing is a really good demonstration as to why. To further drive the point home that our existing conception of primary colors aren't quite right, I want to show you just how mixable that cadmium palette really is. Okay, so here is our new true primary palette. This is mixed deliberately to show some of our kind of traditional primary palette and how these aren't actually true primaries. So you can see here Cad Red is on the end, and we've actually mixed a really good replica of that with the Permanent Rose and the Cad Lemon. Here we have Cad Yellow Pale. It looks almost identical in person. There's a little bit of a difference on camera. And then, of course, ultramarine. With that being said, I would say that thinking of this traditional cadmium palette, so Cad Red, Cad Yellow Pale, and ultramarine, as being the kind of go-to primary palette, I would definitely question that. Now, what I would say is that looking at the three of these, each of them has somewhat distinct advantages. So obviously with our new true primary palette, there's a whole lot of chroma here. But if you need potency, this is probably your best bet. I'm gonna skip over the other palette for now. Now, looking at like our earth tone primary, so alizarin permanent, yellow ochre pale, and ultramarine blue, you might be wondering like, well, why would I use this? And you might have been wondering that before if you were picking cadmiums for your primary palette. And I would say the advantage of this palette is that if you don't have things in your composition that are this bright, look at how harmonious this palette looks. I think it'd be much easier to make a composition that had really cohesive, pleasing color if you limited yourself to this. And then of course, in between those two, with a little bit more range, but a little bit more cohesion than this palette, you have that Cad Red, Cad Yellow Pale, and Ultramarine palette. So I didn't want to make this video to suggest that like this is the best palette or this is the best palette, as it were. But it was really just to kind of open your eyes to why you might be having trouble mixing some things, especially if you are using a limited palette and have been wondering why you just haven't been able to achieve certain colors. If that's the case, or if you are using more of a limited palette to paint things that are really vivid, like flowers for instance, I would really suggest that you give this palette a go. But you know, if you're painting plein air and don't have anything this intense in your composition, it might totally be worth it to stick with this more earth tone palette. Now, one thing I will say for that palette is I wanted to stick with something really traditional, and I also wanted to kind of diversify the pigments I was using compared to these other two palettes. So I chose Alizarin Permanent as my red here. So I would definitely choose that over Alizarin Crimson, which is not light fast. But what I will say is that Alizarin Permanent, as far as I understand it, is a variation on Permanent Rose or Permanent Magenta, but just a less chromatic version of them. So it is very, very possible to mix what's effectively Alizarin Permanent using your Permanent Rose or your Permanent Magenta. And obviously, you know, I don't have to prove that this palette has more power than this one, but you can imagine how it would not be hard to mix that alizarin crimson color based off of that. And even though we aren't trying to mix things that are more earth tone in this particular palette, you can absolutely mix all of these colors using that if you really want to. So if you're looking for sheer power of a palette, then I would say this Cadmium, Permanent Rose, and Phthalo palette is really potent. And, you know, it absolutely has that capability. But the question is, do you need it, and is it helpful? With the exception of Permanent Rose, you know, Cadmium and Phthalo are really strong colors. They have really high tinting strength and can almost be kind of a pain to have on a palette for that reason. You can't build up a substantive mixture with a good amount of phthalo without having a ton of another color that you're trying to put into the mixture, which can be a little bit annoying. So just because it's more chromatic doesn't mean that it is necessarily better. And I think what I'm really trying to show you here is simply that you just want to pick the palette that's going to best suit your application. If you don't need the vibrancy but could benefit from focusing on color harmony, earth tone is probably the way to go. Or if you are painting plein air and you know there are a ton of bright wildflowers maybe, or wow, I can't really think of another good application for like plein air painting, but if for whatever reason you really need that potency and you are confident in your color harmony abilities as a painter, then this might be the way to go. And of course, the middle ground is always an option, but just keep in mind that these are not true primaries, and that if you are looking to mix something and you're really struggling and it's really chromatic, it's probably because your primaries aren't true primaries. And even over here, the colors that we've mixed, the pigments that we've used, these are not perfect either. There are absolutely colors that just can't be mixed with this palette, like any other, but it just has fewer limitations than either of these two have. So, you know, no pigment is perfect, no palette is perfect. We can't mix every possible color, but this one is probably going to be the most powerful if that's what you need. And of course, you can always supplement with specialty colors as needed. And that is it for today's video. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope this has given you a better understanding of the limitations of common primary palettes and how you can either use that to your advantage or overcome that obstacle by swapping out your typical primaries for the ones that we discussed today. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like so that other painters like you can find this, and I hope that you'll subscribe and hit the bell icon if you haven't already so that you know whenever new videos come out. I hope you and your loved ones are safe, and until next time, happy painting. You already have as many mice as you need. Yeah. You have all the mice that you need. I'm not going to help you.